supports caterpillars, fall berries for birds, early season blooms for native pollinators, erosion control, we've got nesting and protection, also carbon sequestration, so taking carbon out of the atmosphere, turning it into usable soil carbon, and storing it. This layer is very important to wildlife, especially birds. And then we have our ground layer, which is about 0 to 4 feet, improves soil health through taking up nitrogen, then releasing it upon decomposition for those higher layers. The roots absorb and filter excess water. The flower heads, when they become seeds, are a source of seed for wildlife. And the ground layer, in particular, in a woodland, and should be in our yards, is full of duff, so dead plant material and stems that offer overwintering protection. So what we see on this trail is black and red oak. We see some sugar and red maple and American beech. And if you look below, you can see how many caterpillars each species supports. So why do caterpillars matter? I'm sure you guys all know this, but we cannot photosynthesize sunlight, sadly. I wish I could. So we need something to transfer that energy from the sun that the plants can take up through the food webs. So one of the most important transfers of that energy is caterpillars. They're eaten by birds, and that, kind of moves throughout the food web very, very effectively. So we know that oak trees in our area support over 700 caterpillar species. We have sugar maple, a host for 225 native species of Lepidoptera. That just means moth and caterpillars, including the eastern tiger swallowtail and mourning cloaks. And we have our American beech supporting 126 caterpillar species. So sometimes a tree, isn't a keystone species like an oak, but supports very rare species, the American beech supporting the early hair streak. We also have a grove of eastern hemlock here. So this is a really important tree species in our area. It acts as an ecosystem engineer. It creates microclimates. It's cooler in the summer. It's warmer in the winter. It provides year-round habitat for 96 bird species. Now, I'm not trying to say this trail is Eden. We still have a lot of stress that we see. So on this trail, there is woolly adelgid and there's beef leaf disease. So these are already affecting the ecosystem here. But what I'm so drawn to on this trail, and that I do not see too much, is a very healthy shrub and small tree layer that really services our birds and wildlife. And these are things that are very well adapted to our yards. So the first bloom we see right now, believe it or not, is American hazelnut. So this is outlining the bottom of the trail into kind of a low-lying wetland area. And by the way, this trail is very well protected from deer and invasives because of the very extreme glacial topography. You probably saw in the images so far, very extreme slope and then a wetland on the bottom. So it's very hard to access. So our American hazelnut offers nuts and protein for mammals. It is a host again for 106 moth and butterfly species. And remember, you probably know this, but 90% of our insects require native plants. So, we may have some non-native plants that aren't getting eaten, but they're not transferring that energy up the food web. So we see a lot of usage on this trail, and you can see it's a host plant here to the polyphemus moth. One of my favorites, we go from the earliest to the latest bloomer, is the native witch hazel. Birds do eat the seed of this. Also, cold-tolerant owlet moths, like this one. This is Morrison sallow. I deed regularly here on this trail. They are moths that are extremely, they don't freeze, basically. They stay active. So they are the pollinators of our native witch hazel. They also attract songbirds at a time when finding winged protein is very difficult. And we have these awesome witchy blooms right in time for the Halloween and later. We have lots of spice bush, and this is common throughout our area when we have wetter, low-lying areas. And here we have March blooms. Mine aren't blooming yet, but they look like they have a couple weeks. And they bloom these beautiful, fluffy, popcorn-like flowers before they leaf out. And then we have September fruit. And that September fruit is what makes spicebush my favorite shrub. So this is a study by a professor at RIT from 2013, and she dehydrated the berries to figure out the fat content. So that spicebush is our fattiest at 50%, fattiest native berry, just in time for bird migration and overwintering. And below it is arrowwood viburnum, so very close second. And you can look at the rest. These are dogwood species. But down at the bottom is our non-native shrubs. So we know that the birds are eating buckthorn berries. Sadly, that's why they're spreading. But they're not nutritious. They're like Skittles for birds, and multiflora rose and honeysuckle. And this is European Guelder rose down here on the bottom. So this is their very low content. They have sugar, but they don't have a lot of fats. So here we can really see that understory layer. This is the spice bush. It turns bright yellow in the fall. In the summer, we see these awesome butterflies, the spice bush swallowtail butterfly, laying eggs, and then we see these excellent caterpillars. And keep in mind, these caterpillars don't foray to Mexico like the monarchs. They stay here. So they overwinter in the pupal stage. And you can see here on this branch, you can see the chrysalis. So they remain dormant, they're in diapause, and then when it gets a little warmer, they drop to that leaf litter, and when it's warm enough, they wake up and emerge. We also have American hornbeam, also vernacularly called musclewood. It looks like mussels. I love this small tree. It's about 25 to 30 feet. A host for 70 species of Lepidoptera. So as you can imagine, there's birds all over. They also eat the little nutkins. We have lots of common serviceberry on this trail. And unlike our other berries, they're not timed to migration, they're timed to nesting. So they're coming in mid-June. They're also called June berries, eaten by 35 species of birds when they need them for mating season. We have our very own native azaleas. We have early azalea on this trail. We also have rosebay and pinkster, and these are pollinated often by hummingbirds. And one of my favorites on this trail, black huckleberry. So this is also an edible berry for humans, but you don't really stand a chance. It's eaten very quickly. And this is later than the serviceberry, coming, right kind of end of June into July. And this is a host to a very rare butterfly, the Henry's elfin, and 39 other species. So pay attention to these flowers. Do you notice how they're facing down? These are in the heath species. Another thing that's special about this trail is that these flowers, there's many, many heath species, including the rhododendron or azalea we just saw. They are only pollinated effectively by native bumblebees that can do buzz pollination. They get up in there, they make a sound, and the pollen comes out like a salt shaker. Foraging European honeybees, sadly, cannot successfully pollinate many of these species. We also have deerberry, sometimes called tall huckleberry. Such a great shrub, not really delicious for humans, although is edible, but a host to 200 Lepidoptera. And these berries are even later. They're timed a little bit later than the huckleberry into fall. So one of the species that's been ID'd on this trail is the red-spotted purple, which is pretty rare. And it's actually the same as the white admiral, same butterfly, but we have the white admiral up in the northern range and the red spotted in the southern range. But this trail is on the border, so you can actually spot both. And it too overwinters in diapause here. So getting to our ground layer, we have golden ragwort, which is really significant for native bees. Nice early bloom in April. We have pussy toes, which is a host for a migrating American painted lady. And then lots of spring ephemerals, which are, plants that basically have a short bloom before the trees leaf out. And also important for our very early emerging ground bees. And then we have things like downy yellow foxglove, which is parasitic on oak roots, and or purple stemmed angelica and bellflower. So some interesting flowering plants that we don't really see in the nurseries. Our a very common ground cover here is eastern teaberry. Notice the flowers. So this too is in the heath species. And then we have cinnamon and sensitive fern in the wetter areas, Christmas fern, and lots of wonderful sedges. We also have a lot of areas of decomposing wood. So this wood is not cleaned up, and thankfully, because it has 4 times the biomass of a living tree. This is like a recycling center of life. All these nutrients going back into the forest floor and then taken up by the higher layers. So all this life, only a mile at point three, and look at this terrible soil. If I went to a yard, the person I was visiting would tell me, "Oh, I have to add compost. This is awful. It's sandy. It's clay." So very much infertile soil there. So to prove to you, there's a lot of life. Here's some of the common IDs on eBird of this trail. So 60 really interesting and varied bird species. In a yard, for comparison, maybe 15 you would notice. So what can we learn from this? There's so much here that, we're looking to our catalogs, but, what can we learn from this right down our street? Okay, we should all look to a trail that's 5 to 10 miles away to get some ideas. You don't have to mimic the entire trail, but just to, what can we learn and apply to our yards? So we can learn that the rotating schedule of wildlife food and blooms from March to November. Many of us just have blooms in the middle of the season. We've got all season beauty. I mean, it looks so gorgeous in the fall, in the winter. Nothing is wasted. Every inch of soil is in use. Leaves and duff are critical for those overwintering pupa and soil health. The right plants, this is the Master Gardener mantra here, right plants for the right place. These plants are well adapted to the site. They're not, you don't have to amend the soil here. Over years, they've adapted. And it's no to low maintenance. We have microclimates such as that hemlock grove and the lower wetlands. So this just means there's kind of like the equivalent of different habitats or different gardens within the bigger system. And then we have that, those vertical layers too. So habitat heterogeneity is the more vertical and horizontal variations you have, the more species that can make a living in that landscape. So how can we look to these local ecosystem types that I'm going to talk about to create habitat in your yard? So let's talk about what they are. So now I'm kind of switching over to the yard framework. So there's 3 very broad ecosystem types or land types in our area. And under each category, there's much more specific assemblages of plants that are often found together, like, a hickory oak forest or, so those will be under each category as I go forward. If you're kind of at that next level and are curious, I use the New York State Heritage plant communities. So we have grasslands and meadows. We don't have prairies here technically, but we have meadows, grasslands, shrublands, and we also have the woodland forest, which we just explored. So how can we match up the conditions in our yards to make the most suitable habitat type gardens? So we don't want to knock down trees to make prairie gardens, right? We want to work with what we have. So we're going to start with a yard woodland garden. What would that look like? Where would you put it? So many local yards have a grove of mature trees, but often underlying them is just turf grass. So adding shrubs and ground layers really helps with habitat, but it also makes it easier for maintenance. The back of our yards where power lines are often wooded, and they can easily be converted into 3 layers of a woodland. You may just have 2 large, huge trees, like my neighborhood has, beautiful, large specimen trees with nothing else. So these can be underplanted with shrubs and ground layers to create little woodland patches. So I'm going to take you on a site visit. This is a yard I visited last spring, and kind of walk you through my process here. So this obviously has a pretty intense canopy. There's a lot of shade, except for a couple, sunny patches. So this property has high value oak and hickory, a missing shrub layer. It's got amazing spring ephemerals, which was a huge surprise. I don't often see them in suburban yards and not many summer pollen sources. So this yard had hickory. So these are some of the common gorgeous moth species we see in our area. And Doug Talamay says moths are basically butterflies that fly at night and don't taste badly. So, we don't seem to be as enamored with moths, but they're very, very important. So the hickory hosts 200 really cool species. These are ones that are found locally. The leaves have a high calcium content, so they're very good soil builders. And those of you who don't know this, the Luna moth overwinters kind of blended in and uses the silk to add leaf litter to the cocoon. So, this is a wonderful case for leaving some leaves in your yard that are unshredded. We know that the oaks are so important, so here's a couple Lepidoptera species. I love this quote by the World Wildlife Foundation. The oak presence dictates the function of the entire ecosystem, making them indispensable components of the natural landscape. So embrace your shady woodland yard is what I say. And these surprising ephemerals were, popping up around the time I was there, which is amazing. So this land was fairly intact in that way. All right, and here's a second property that's very wooded and very, similar with the overstory and the shade. But in this case, they actually did have understory shrubs, but mostly non-native. So we have Chinese witch hazel, Korean viburnum, and European buckthorn. And I want to be clear, this couple, by the way, was in their 70s. You do not need to take every non-native plant out of your yard. I think, the goal should always be to target about 70% natives. A lot of these are non-invasive, so they don't spread to our wild areas. They're not spreading behind your yard or beyond your yard, and they're not displacing natives. So they're okay to leave, but why not add some native plants there to add those ecosystem services? But this one, you got to get out or pay someone to get out, the buckthorn. So anything that is invasive, you want to try to prioritize that to the best of your ability. So some additions suggested would be flowering dogwood, Canadian serviceberry. These are all adapted to shade to the understory, and American witch hazel. The inventory of the ground layers here, it was pretty minimal. When you go to a commercial nursery, it can be hard to find, midsummer flowering shade plants. So they had wolfsbane. This can stay. This is, there's honeybees using it and generalists. But, this has got to go because it is invasive. And by the way, 270 North American plants are invasive in China. So our plants are invasive. Our beloved northern red oak is invasive in Europe. So it's not about, one place. It's about the displacement of plants out of their evolutionary history. So suggested addition to ground layers and shady yards, and we had a wonderful sedge talk last month, but here's some that I love. And these all get, a flowering period or seed head in the early season around May. And that's actually the best time to try to ID them as well, because they can be really hard to ID. There's always room for spring ephemerals because they go dormant. So you can have, they have fairly shallow roots. You can put in deeper rooted plants, within them for when they go dormant. But we also have lots and lots of shade plants that do bloom mid to late summer and do service our native pollinators. So here's some examples. And I have these, in the shadiest parts of my yard doing absolutely fine. And these are all pretty dry shade. So using layers, they're not just going to make this land support more life, but it's also easier to maintain and more beautiful. Can you imagine mowing around these trees? That sounds absolutely terrible. Okay, so moving right along, I'm going to check the time here. We've got shrubland gardens. This is probably one of my favorite types of yard gardens. And basically, many of our yards were cleared of trees from farming and then development. and then dotted with kind of foundation shrubs in the 40s, 50s, and 60s through the 90s. They were almost always non-contributors or invasives, things like burning bush. So these are, yards where you got these. This is a perfect place to make a shrubland garden. So yards that have non-native hedgerows are easily converted. Yards that have non-native foundation shrubs, they can be replaced, rather than one just floating, with a cluster of native shrubs. And yards that have privacy screens also make excellent shrub islands or vice versa. We do have the Finger Lakes National Forest is managed as shrubland, meaning, it's not the best land. It had been farmed for many years. It was given out as free farmland. So the canopy, the higher layers, they don't grow well there, but they still pop up. But it is being managed as a very large, shrubby, basically shrub garden. So the woodland garden has the three layers, the shrubland just has two, and it's made up of brushy openings. It's so important for wildlife, nesting, and fruit. From a design standpoint, and this is why I love it, it has room-like spaces and microclimates. It's the layer that's most affected, sadly, by the invasives in our yard, but it's also the most important garden type for bird lovers. So these are some site visits I've done that have areas that could easily be converted into a nice native shrubland garden. They're often areas that were privacy screens at one point, or areas of shrubs like dogwoods in, maybe in the 60s and 70s, and then they were overtaken by honeysuckles, bittersweet vine, or buckthorn, and just, no one really, it's kind of a forgotten part of the yard anyway. So these are great areas to adapt. And this one's a double whammy, a bittersweet strangling a buckthorn here. Um, so why are we missing these native shrubs? Most trails I go to don't have them. Most yards I go to don't have the native shrubs. And, they're so important for our birds. So the invasives really caused a big problem in our deer population. Invasive, non-native plants tend to leaf out first. They have no, deer don't eat them. They have no natural predators. And then the birds, as we talked about, spread the berries, whether they're healthy or not, beyond your yard. So, burning bush in our yards, it's okay. It doesn't spread all crazy in the yard, but the birds spread it. So this is high quality floodplain forest around Irondequoit Creek full of burning bush and barberry. So these are things that you do need to prioritize, taking out of your yard. And privet does go wild even in your own yard, but look at it in a natural area. So you can imagine that it's so hard for those native shrubs to stand a chance. So I'm going to leaf through these. I'm not going to talk about each one. Feel free to email me any questions. These are some of my favorites. So all the native shrubs I'm going to show have the commonality of the very early season blooms and the very late season berries, except for service berries, more of a midsummer berry. We've got our native viburnums. My mom was born in 1951. She says there were dogwoods everywhere when she was growing up. And then if you're into edibles and, kind of edible forests, a lot of our edible natives are excellent wildlife trees and really good in this type of garden. Winterberry is a great one. It loses its leaves but maintains these berries. They're not eaten until much later in the season by birds. And then to replace that burning bush, these two have really gorgeous fall color, high bush blueberry and fragrant sumac. So what does a shrubland garden that's designed professionally look like? Again, it's got the room vibe. It's got this like place you go to in your yard. It's usually, full of the sound of birds, songbirds. Here's a front yard that has a shrubland garden. So take advantage of that room-like microclimate, make a cluster of these 10 to 20 foot shrubs or small trees. It'll be full of songbirds. You can add a path, seating, bird baths. And then finally on this section, some tips from Larry Weiner, who's ecological landscape designer based out of Philly. Which, by the way, he has a yard in Abington in the city that's only 1/3 of an acre. So if you have a small yard, you should check out some images of his yard. So he says, plant strategically, group shrubs in dense masses to create effective shelter and habitat. Integrate with those bottom layers with grasses and perennials to build a layered dynamic landscape. And mimic nature. Design your landscape to function like a natural one, focusing on ecological benefits rather than static aesthetics. So finally, the topic that I think most people are interested in is the meadow grassland garden. This is a garden you want to put in yards that is perfect for yards that are predominantly turf grass. Can become gorgeous full sun pollinator meadows. These could also be rain gardens. That's also considered a meadow or a grassland. Low-lying areas that don't drain well, can be a beautiful wet meadow, or just large swaths of turf grass in the shade. I go to a lot of places where the owner says, "Oh, I can't grow grass in this part. What can I do?" Well, a sedge meadow is beautiful, like the one we saw under the tree. Sedge is adapted to the woodland shade. We do have grasslands here in our area, the Oak Savanna and Rush Henrietta. And it's basically an open area of flowering plants and grasses. It's created by a natural disturbance because if we let our land go and nothing had ever happened to it, our whole area would just be forest. But they were always open areas. They could be from a natural edge, like a wetland kind of lower area to a forest, a lightning strike, or they could be human made. So grasslands were carefully maintained by indigenous people through controlled burns. They were areas for hunting, travel, and food production. And from a design standpoint, evolutionarily, they say the savanna is the most preferred landscape. It makes us feel safe. We can kind of see the whole view. It's beautiful. It kind of shows abundance. And we have the long view of the horizon and intermingled dense grasses and flowering plants. In your yard, one thing you'll think about with this type of garden is that there's horizontal plant patterns. They really kind of you see them, as these kind of patterns in space. All right, so this is an example of an area that I visited in Penfield, and this humongous grass lot, and it drains down into a watershed body of water with a golf course not far away. So we've got too much turf grass. This person really wants a meadow, and this is a great site for it. And so, why put it in there? There's so many ecosystem services of a meadow. And the main, I feel like the biggest one are these deep roots that are going to filter water and, really break up the soil. Look at the roots of the turf grass here. So it's really one step up from a impervious surface. There's not a lot of absorption. So these plants are going to filter that water, before it goes into the watershed. So they're really important in that way. So I'm going to give practical tips on this topic since there was a lot of interest in this. So tips for creating a meadow and we have a lot of turf grass, most of us, for creating meadow or grassland in your yard. So 1/4 acre and smaller, honestly, it's easier to use plugs and plants. But 1 acre and up, you need seeds because it's going to get prohibitively expensive. So step one, we've got to remove the grass. And there's a lot of different methods. They all have pros and cons, and they really are based on your particular, situation. So soil scouring is a lot like turf removal, but it's a little lower. So it's aimed at 2 to 3 inches, eliminating weed seeds and deep roots. It's good for small yards. It's too much work for a very big meadow. Tilling is great if you live on a farm and you want to make a meadow and you have some farming equipment. But you could do it at in a yard, but just know that it really disturbs the weed bank. So you're going to see a lot of weeds that were in the lower levels of that soil coming up to the top. So it's not a one and done deal. You have to do it several times to bring those weeds up and, let them kind of get, knocked back down. So, not the easiest method. So if you have a very large space, maybe you have some land you're restoring, chemical option is always, there are definite positives to it in that setting. So best suited for non-residential large properties, always use a licensed professional. It actually does not disturb the soil layers like, say, tilling does. You can see here down at the bottom, this is Laurel's Garden Design based in North Carolina. They have licensed professionals come in on the sites that they plant meadows and do that. For them, these are very large meadows. And then smothering and solarization. And this is really what I recommend the most for yards. So cardboard or plastic tarp to block photosynthesis and kill the grass. But it's not going to work in a huge, 1/4 of an acre or bigger area. The deer are going to step on it. It's going to get weeds coming through it anyway. So these images are from Flock Finger Lakes. If you've never looked them up, you might want to. They're very inspiring. They're three individuals restoring this beautiful tract of land down below Ithaca, and all their projects are online. It's very fun to watch. But look at this, the cardboard, how effective it is. And, you basically put the cardboard over the grass and then mulch. Some people do some compost. I have found that I don't need it. And over a season, it degrades. And if you're impatient like me, you can plant the plants and put the cardboard around them, get their deep roots in, clear in, just enough to plant the plants, and then use the cardboard around them. And that will definitely smother your grass. Now, if you have really intense weeds, doesn't always do it. So you'd have to use one of the other methods. So step two is your plant choices. It's really important to include a grass or a sedge. Even if you love flowers and you think that sounds so boring, I'll tell you some reasons as we go. It's actually critical for the success. So number one, pick your grass or sedge as a matrix. It's kind of like the backdrop or the substrate. And then match your site conditions and pick 1 to 2 successional blooms for each period. So early, mid, and late summer. I think most of us have more of a yard setting. So to pick less blooms makes this type of meadow look more formal and gives it pattern. You don't necessarily, it just depends on what you're looking for, but a lot of people prefer that kind of more formal look when you're already, the format of this is kind of a bit informal, can look wild. Examples that I picked for this like little demonstration is site conditions are medium, medium dry, or medium wet, and the light is full to partial. So here's the options for grasses that I would typically give somebody to pick, and they all have different heights but these can all handle medium, which is kind of the realm I'm in, and most grasses need full sun except for like bottle brush grass. So I picked Little Blue Stem. It's one of my favorites. It gets about 3 feet. It's not a super spreader. So, my yard is not even an acre. I love, my absolute favorite grass is Indian grass, but it's a little too aggressive for a small setting. So additional grasses, benefits of grasses. They basically recycle their nutrients, a half of their roots each year. We've already talked about this, but they really enhance that filtration with those deep roots. And really importantly, they suppress weeds. They're going to fill in around your plants. And they sequester carbon. A lot of people don't realize that, but a 10-foot long root of grass captures that atmospheric carbon and brings it down into the soil. It also structurally supports blooms. The flowering plants can be kind of floppy, especially in garden soil. So the root systems on these grasses will really hold them up. They are amazingly beautiful in the fall, and they support birds, skippers, and moths. So here's an example of what I might offer, if I was giving advice, early species. So picking 1 to 2. Here's some examples. Midsummer, so I'm talking about the blooms, so that you have blooms for the early, mid, and late summer. Again, picking 1 to 2. and then our late flowering species. So these take us, some of them all the way into November. So step three, my mother, I showed this to her earlier and she thought this looked totally stressful. But plan your layout. I like to use 1 inch graph paper and markers. You can just use little circle templates. You don't need to be fancy or a digital platform. It's actually pretty easy to do this on Photoshop or something like that. So this little design is 13. I used a ruler by 15. And actually, I might be wrong, but my calculations are for that. So let's go with that. And typically, you plant one plant per square foot. So in the 13 by 15 foot scenario, that would be 195 plants. So if you were to get plant plugs, which are plants that are grown into kind of deep plugs that go right into the ground, that would be about $585 for this size. And if you were to do quart size plants, about 1560. So just so you have an idea. And you can see I have for my early species, Golden Alexander and Red Columbine. And that's, they would kind of pop up. You would still see the green popping up, coming up from the grasses at this time. That would be consistent throughout. In the midsummer, you would see the pink bee balm or wild bergamot and the orange milkweed. And then in the late summer to fall, you would see the blue and the purple of the New England aster. This is what the little blue stem, whoops, looks like in that time of year in the fall. So it's just beautiful to have those asters with the reddish, misty native grasses. So that's an example of, because a lot of these are going to overlap. So this is, what it might look at a given time. Like the golden Alexanders often bloom, well into the late summer. And with this kind of scenario, does not have to be a rectangle, just was the easiest for me to show you. You can kind of work on it modularly. Say you did, one of these units 1 year, take a break, and then save up your pennies. And then the following year, do a second one. You can put a 4-foot path in between, and all of a sudden you're starting to have this much larger meadow. So, think about large masses of the same plant look more formal. You use drifts and masses to create patterns. So masses is like this kind of round cluster here, and the drifts create almost like a line in the landscape. So you want to think about combining those two formations of plants. And, I've talked about this, but thinking about that seasonal interest. So here are those grasses in the back here. Looks like little blue stem actually with some, late season, probably, this is a Benjamin image. This is the front of his house. And some probably heart-shaped aster here, and the seed heads left, and it is just breathtaking. And then step four is planting day. It can be overwhelming to plant this many plants. I would buy your friends pizza and make it a party, give everyone, one little section. You can use landscape spray paint. It's like a chalk spray paint to section things out. You can have some 1-foot rulers and just kind of do it ad hoc, putting all the plants about a foot from each other. There's also these landscape flags that can really help you kind of map it out. And you can see this little garden bed is done with this technique. And here's the design here. So you can print out your design and bring it and kind of lay it out. All right, and lastly, I'm going to cover this minimally, but I want to say that Sam Quinn is the man. If you have a huge space you want to seed, and his manual, you can take a picture of this. It's through SUNY ESF, and you could just Google this landowner manual seeding meadows. But this is the link to it down there if you want to take a picture. He has a downloadable handout that is just excellent. So for 1/4 of an acre and larger, just to give you an idea of the cost, it is, about $85 for 100 or up to 100 per pound of seed. So 8 pounds for a 1/4 acre. So just to compare, so we're looking at about $800 at most for seeds to cover that much space. If we did plugs, it would be $33,000 and $88,000 for plants. So this is where this method, it's not easy, but it is the best method for a large area. So you want to pick seeds that are as locally adapted as possible. They're going to do better. This is really important that you get, maybe from air seed, which will give you local options, or local native plant sellers that are selling seed mixes. Your site prep is even more important because the weeds can really disrupt this. So you want to pick one of those more intensive preps that I listed in the beginning. And then you would rake the prepped site and you're creating little kind of divots and disperse the seed. For a quarter acre, you could do it with friends by hand. You want to put the seed in a kind of damp sand medium so that the big and the small seeds kind of have the same weight to them. And then most importantly, after you get all the seed down, you want to cover it with this tack straw. It's a mulch that's got a little bit of a stickiness to it that will stay down. So the challenging thing about a meadow, and I've done it in a small setting, not this big, is that it takes a long time to establish. So they say it can take up to 10 years for all the plants you intended to be there to kind of be at their proportions, and there's some maintenance along the way. The most important maintenance is that first year. There's a pretty strict mowing schedule. Otherwise, you're going to get your tallest plants are going to survive, and those shorter plants are never going to stand a chance. They're not going to get enough sun. So he details this, much more specifically in that manual. But, a lot of people will say, oh, yeah, I'm just going to throw some seeds in the grass. And it's actually a science. And there's a lot of maintenance. But boy, when you get it, it will last a very, very long time. All right, so here's some examples where we can see beautiful grasslands. This is a seeded meadow. It's also hard to get the patterns that you can get with a plug or planted one, but you can, go in and add plants to a seeded meadow to give it a little more structure and hierarchy. And here's a sedge meadow, so completely, at least part of it is very much in the shade. This one, because of those very clear patterns and limited species looking very formal. So if you wanted something right in front of your house, this is a good approach. These are meadow gardens that I've done. I like to play a lot with clusters and height. Okay, so that's it. I want to say though that the plants on this PowerPoint are not rare. Most of them, in fact, the meadow model that I did is based on rush oak openings. The ones that I chose are found there. So most of these plants are all around us, but they can be hard to find at box stores. So, think about looking to local smaller nurseries to find them. Even the shrubs that I listed can be found here locally with, quite good prices as well. So White Oak Nursery in Canandaigua, Amanda's Garden in Springwater, Plantsman in Ithaca, and there's a bunch of new cool nurseries down near Ithaca, a little further south, and one in Skinny Atlas. I didn't put on there just because of the distance. Redmont Nursery for those of you in Monroe County, Butterfly Effect in Geneva. And then my own, I have a home-based nursery, but I sell online in May and out of the farmers market. So that is all.